Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today as co-host is Chris Rosini. Chris, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Very good. Today we'd like to spend some time on an issue I've spent 30 or 40 years thinking about and trying to rein in, and that is the Federal Reserve and the power of the Federal Reserve and trying to find out what they're doing, just asking for an audit of the Fed. So it's a big issue, and even when I started, I didn't realize how big an issue it really is, and it continues to be, and it's significantly related to civil liberties, war, welfare, the whole works, and the deep state as well. And so we're going to sort of break this down into three different eras. Of course, the Fed is the principal culprit in our scenario here. And the Fed, of course, most people know it was started in 1913 as a consequence of some problems that the banks and state banking systems created. And they had booms and busts. And they said, well, what we need is a central bank. And they got together and created the Fed, which came into existence under Woodrow Wilson in 1913. And though there were warnings at that time, it just didn't happen overnight, because the goal really was to make sure there was no free market money or free market interest rates, and that they would have total control of an economy. And big government and dictatorships need that. They essentially always take over control of the money system, and they always have these very, very strict legal tender laws. So we have this period of time that we'll start with, Chris, of 1913, and I take it up to 1971. And that was a period of time where systematically, from the very beginning, the Fed started destroying any relationship of our currency to gold, which was achieved. So why don't you go from there and tell us what you think about this Federal Reserve system and what they have been doing, and why people should be awakened to the fact that this is a big problem, and that we have to continue to study this and continue to warn people of the dangers of central banking.
Yes, and we could start from today. Today, the U.S. government and its military empire are the biggest government and empire in the history of the world. So how did they get to this point? And we can go back to 1913 when they started separating gold from money to use their paper money instead. And the purpose is so that government can create and finance itself, which is the worst thing in the world. You never want government to be able to finance itself. We should be the ones that should hold the purse strings, either personally or through our representatives. They don't want any restraints. So we have a monetary system of empire. And unfortunately, there's really nothing, in my opinion, that can be done to stop it. But there is a good plus side to this. Every empire in history always ends because they run up against supply and demand, economic law. That's what always puts it to rest.
And the self-destruction of the currency that they mess up. And you know, the motivation is something to think about. Why do they do this? And there's motivation. It's not like it's they haven't thought it through and they don't have a purpose. We should think about that, even though the purpose, from our viewpoint, is never very honorable. But it's the people who want a free lunch. That's the reason they like to have free money and not worry about deficits. So the Fed is necessary for those in the welfare system, and that includes the corporate welfare as well. So the subsidy that comes from the Fed and the creation of money and artificial interest rates supports crony capitalism. And that, of course, is a deadly problem, because it creates the malinvestment and the maldistribution of wealth, and you have the rich becoming richer and the poor poorer, and the wiping out of the middle class. So it's very, very serious. The other reason people like it might even be some who are sort of academically minded, but they like power. And this is where the power is, because you know, the Congress is limited in what they can spend and how much debt they have if they don't have a Federal Reserve system. They have to tax people, and that usually brings a halt to this much sooner. But as soon as the government, as soon as the Congress spends money, then it's dumped on the Fed, and the Fed has to monetize. So it's a collusion, it's a conspiracy, it's been around, and it has systematically gotten worse from 1913. Of course, immediately after 1913, they financed us unnecessarily getting into World War I. And then, of course, that inflation created a depression in 1921, which was short-lived because back then they didn't believe in bailing out everybody. But they went right back to inflating through the 20s, creating another bubble, a stock market bubble that ended with a crisis. And then the depression was ushered in, and everything they did was wrong. Republicans and Democrats and central banking. So what did they do then? With an executive order, Roosevelt took all the gold from the people at $20 an ounce, and then he remonetized at $35 an ounce. So it's very mischievous from the very early on. And then they limped along, and then it was changed significantly after World War II. We had the advantages of not being clobbered in World War II. So at the end of World War II, they had this Bretton Woods agreement, and that ushered in, the Bretton Woods, which was still a pseudo gold standard. But as you know, Chris, that wasn't much better than what they had, and it was just a refusal to have an honest gold standard. So they came up with this gimmick, which even at that time, just as it was in 1913, there were people who warned about what would happen, but there were people who warned us in 1945 that Bretton Woods couldn't work. And so that was another deal that we had to work on, and of course it led to a lot of problems after 1971.
Yes, 1971, the whole system was put on steroids. But, this system, there's been cracks ever since the beginning, starting with the Depression. That was the Fed that fueled that bubble and then burst, and then it burst. But now the bubbles are bigger, stronger, and more violent. They're taking down their own now. Just in 2008, the Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, Merrill Lynch, AIG, it was a slew of them. This was not planned. These are trillion-dollar companies, and they were gone in an instant. So what we're seeing is that this system is falling apart. And in 2008, they were scrambling, didn't know what to do. So what did they do? They flooded with trillions and trillions, unheard of amounts of money they created to try to keep this thing afloat. And we're going to get to what's coming ahead, Dr. Paul.
Yeah, and that was a consequence of the fact that the Bretton Woods didn't last. From 1971, that it broke down then. It ended, but that ushered in an age of massive inflation. And even early on, the 1970s, we had stagflation, depressed economy, rampant inflation. It went on and on. We even had a stock market crash of 1987, which ushered in the nonsense of saying that what was necessary to prevent this. They wouldn't talk about the Fed. They say what we need is a plunge protection team. We need the Fed and Treasury and the government itself to bail out everybody. And of course, that took us all the way up to the point where we had first the NASDAQ bubble collapsing, and then they went back to inflating in the early part of this century and had the housing bubble. And it too was predictable, and that is what happened. And you mentioned it in 2008, 2009, the Great Recession occurred, and that meant they ushered in the age of QE. And QE, of course, went, and increased the monetary base and increased the holdings of the Fed by over $3 trillion. And this is all inflationary. And so now we are suffering the consequences. Now they're pretending that, oh yes, it looks pretty good now. Maybe we can get out of this mess we have that's been created by zero rates of interest rate and pretending there is no inflation. But I think that is coming to an end. Now, the next big step that I think that people have to look at for date-wise was actually the peak of the Dow Jones, and that was, I think, this past January, is 26,000. Now it's coupled down 3,000. It's up and down. There's violent shifts up and down, but I don't think it's going over 26,000 for a long, long time. And I think this has ushered in this new period of time where there will be corrections, and you mentioned already about how much debt has accumulated. I think the debt in 2009 was around $10 trillion. Now it's $21 trillion. The deficits have exploded. This administration, thank goodness the conservatives are in, because the debt is only going to go up $1 trillion this year. What would the liberals have done? So this continues. I just don't believe it's going to last. I think a lot of people know that, even though those people who trade stocks and bonds and all the commodities, I think they know it too, but they're still living on the short run. But long term, they know this is not sustainable, because when you look at what's happening around the world, there's more talk now of what's going to replace the dollar. And, the Chinese are talking about it, the Indians are talking about it, Russia's talking about it, and they're starting to trade in gold and trying to get away from the dollar. But also we have seen a great interest in other countries who have stored their gold in the United States are asking for their gold back, because many of them stored the gold here because it was a safer haven, and we were more market oriented, and we weren't destroyed or bombed during World War I and World War II. But for some reason they've decided, hey, we think we want to take our gold back, and they're coming to find out it. You don't call up the Fed and say, hey, we've had our gold at your place, send us our gold. We find out it's very, very slow in being repatriated. But I think the whole idea that they're thinking about that. And also I think there's a lot of people who are playing on an issue that I have dealt with, and that is the competing currencies, denationalization of money that Hayek has talked about. And so they've worked real hard on trying to come up with a new idea on cryptocurrencies, which is yet to be determined, how successful it will be. But as long as there's options like this, we like to see the competition, which means that they are saying, the dollar should be questioned. How long can we do this? How long can we keep running up these deficits? And they are limited, and I think that's what we're reaching at this period of time, where people know it's going to end and something has to be done about it. And more people now are skeptical of the Federal Reserve than they've ever been really throughout our history. And all I can do is think about what it was like to bring this subject up in 1976 when I went to Congress, and now, and there's a lot more support for, hey, open up the books and we don't trust you. There's something wrong. It's serving the crony capitalists and the banking system and globalism, and the least we ought to have is an opening up of the books. But good luck, because it looks like they're going to fight that to the bitter end, and we'll probably see, I'm afraid, further deterioration, maybe total destruction of the dollar, where it will be absolutely necessary for a reform of our monetary system. And I think that's the kind of thing that we should all be thinking about. Chris?
Yes, I'll finish up, Dr. Paul, echoing some of what you said. We are in the biggest bubble of them all that the Fed has created. We have a welfare system that is unsustainable, promises that'll never be kept, debt that will never be paid, an empire that they don't know what they're doing around the world. We're finding out where troops are. I mean, we just have to use our eyes and common sense to see that this is totally unsustainable, and new ideas are going to have to replace the old. So if you're watching this show, you're one of the few lucky ones that are exposed to the ideas. Please help us to spread it. Tell your friends to subscribe to our show, because this is serious stuff. And the more people that understand, the better it will be to rebuild things after it falls.
This, and that's very true, Chris. And you mentioned even the foreign entanglements and our troops overseas, and we spend a lot of time on this program talking about that. And that is an issue that is very important, because if you look at other empires and great nations, what they tend to do is they get too bold. They think they are the powerhouses. They think they are the moralists of the world, and they want to spread their exceptionalism, which we tend to think that we should be doing. But most of the empires stretch themselves too thinly throughout all history, and then it collapses because they can't control it and they can't finance it. And in recent history, that's exactly what happened to the Soviet system. So that plays a big role in it, and that causes the dislike and disdain for us. And one of the reasons that people are motivated, other countries are motivated to have alternative currencies so they don't have to be dependent on the dollar, nor do they like the idea that we can punish them if they don't do what we tell them, because we'll put on sanctions and deny them access to some of the banking procedures, and that is not good. But domestically, it leads to a lot of turmoil as well. And we have a lot of social discord going on right now. And yet, we hear about how wonderful everything is. The unemployment rate is low and there's no inflation. And yet, the degree of discord is way out of proportion to what the pretense is about what's happening domestically. But we have the contention, I believe most of it comes from the fact that there's so much discrepancy between the rich and the poor. And many have used this analogy that I think is important. They say the 3 richest people in the world have as much wealth as the lower 50% of the people of the world. And that leads to problems. And this will lead to rebellion against this. And the biggest problem there that I see is they say, well, that's because you guys who believe in free markets, that's why this has happened. That is not the consequence of free market. Free markets that we've experienced in this country created the biggest middle class and the greatest amount of freedom ever before, and the greatest amount of prosperity. There were wealthy people, and there will always be wealthy people, but they should be rewarded for providing jobs and good products for the middle class, and both sides benefit. But that is not the case now. It is there's a lot of social discord, and just look at our university campus and cultural Marxism, and this whole nonsense is just dividing the people. And I believe it originates through economic matters, the principles of liberty, the whole idea of not reigning in empires. This is the reason we get to this point. But the reason we emphasize, and I've talked so much about monetary policy and the Federal Reserve, is none of this can happen because there would not be this gross distortion of the value of money, the gross malinvestment and all the debt accumulation, the undermining of our liberties, the welfare state as well as the warfare state and the empire. It would never happen. Can you imagine what it would be like if every month an American citizen and family would have to write a check to pay some of the bills for, just say, overseas, just for the militarism overseas. And now, I worked hard in trying to prevent that Iraq war and all those wars in the Middle East, but now it's almost universal that the Iraq war was stupid. It was foolish. It made no sense. And yet, what are we doing around the world now? We're doing the same policy, performing the same policy in Syria. And we get involved in Ukraine when we shouldn't be involved. We're involved all across Africa. We had total failure in Libya. So that is all that. But it wouldn't happen if they couldn't deceive the people and borrow in the future, print the money. The penalty goes on the middle class. There's always a payment. The middle class usually has to pay the bills. There's always a delay, sometime even to another generation, but ultimately the profiteers, whether it's the profiteers of the welfare here at home or the profiteers from the warfare state and the military-industrial complex, they get the profits and they don't get the punishment. And it will not work out unless people understand how free markets work, why liberty is so much better than totalitarianism, and why you can't have that without sound, honest money. And if the government won't give it to us soon and immediately, then we have to fight for the right to do it on our own and let the people decide what should be the currency. That's the way money originated, and that's the way it's happened over the centuries. But we're in the midst of this crisis. The crisis has already started. I date it from January this year. The stock market is precarious. Our liberties are precarious. The foreign policy is in a precarious state. A crisis is brewing, and we need to understand this if we want to do anything positive in solving those problems. So I want to not close with more fear and concern as much as saying, Well, we are making progress. More people now than ever are understanding free market economics. More young people that I meet are understanding and are desirous of liberties, and more people are starting to understand monetary policy. Ideas have consequences, and I think we're making inroads there, although they have not quite reached Washington, D.C. yet. But eventually, if the ideas are worthy, they will reach all our government officials. But we have to be alert. And it'll become a lot easier later on if we had the right size government. It wouldn't be so difficult because the government would only be about 10 or 15% of the size it is today. It would be the people that would be running the country, not the deep state and not the bankers and not the Federal Reserve. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.